Howdy folks, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike, and this next to me here is the 2022 GT Force. Now the Force is GT's long travel enduro race bike. It gets an all new frame for 2022 with a beefy carbon mainframe paired to an alloy rear. It's all built around 29-inch wheels with a 170mm travel fork and 160mm of rear wheel travel. Of course, the big story with the new GT Force is its move to that high pivot suspension design, which employs an idler wheel to control chain growth. The geometry has also been updated with a move to a very steep 78-degree seat tube angle to improve the climbing position. All the other geometry has been biased towards descending performance though. We've got a very slack 63.5-degree head angle, and on our medium-sized test bike, a 455mm reach measurement. It's also quite tall at the front end. This bike has a 636mm stack height, and that's been amplified by these 30mm rise handlebars. Also cool to see is an adjustable dropout flip chip. Now, small and medium-sized frames will come set up in the short position, and that delivers a 435mm rear center length. The large and extra large frames will come from the factory in the long position, and that increases the rear center length to 445mm. It's fairly straightforward to change around between these two settings, and it's a really nice feature for riders to be able to tune the handling of this bike to suit their terrain and riding style. There are 3 GT Force models available for 2022, and all of them are built around the same frame. The bike that we've been testing here sits in the middle. This is the GT Force Carbon Pro, and it has a recommended retail price of $6,799 Australian dollars. It's equipped with a RockShox Zeb Select Plus fork and a Super Deluxe Select Plus shock. We've got a SRAM NX Eagle drivetrain with a GX derailleur. There's a Code R brake set with a 200mm rear rotor and a whopping 220mm rotor on the front. We've got a custom wheel set with WTB ST I-29 rims and Formula hubs, and those are wrapped with a Maxxis Assegai 2.5-inch tyre on the front and a Minion DHR2 in a 2.4-inch width on the rear. Now, confirmed weight for our medium-sized test bike here, weighed without pedals and with the tyre set up tubeless, is a very generous 16.24 kilograms. Now, it did take us a few rides on the GT Force to get the suspension dialed in because it felt quite unbalanced when we first received it. The RockShox Zeb was fitted with 3 bottomless tokens inside the air spring, and the result was a really uncompliant, awkwardly tall and pingy ride quality, which felt very unbalanced with the relatively linear and plush rear suspension. We removed all of those volume spacers out of the fork, and that radically improved small bump sensitivity and overall comfort, and it allowed us to get more weight onto the front wheel. The other problem we had was that we set up the rear shock with 30% sag to begin with. While it was very plush and traction was amazing, it did feel too glued to the ground, and the overly soft rear also meant that our weight balance was off. We ended up increasing the shock pressure and lifting that sag to 25%, which helped to balance the dynamic ride height while improving support all round. Once the suspension was set up properly, the GT Force impressed us with just how wickedly fast this bike is on the descents. There's a reassuring solidity to that chunky frame, which is complemented nicely with the Zeb up front with those big 38mm upper tubes. And thanks to the long wheelbase, the raked out head angle and the tall front end, it feels very planted and stable at high speed. The high pivot suspension also delivers impressive square edge compliance. The rear wheel is able to get out of the way when smashing through toothy rock gardens, smoothing out the chunder and actually allowing you to accelerate through it. Indeed, the way it builds speed and carries momentum through chunky and technical trails is quite incredible. The active suspension also generates a huge amount of grip, keeping both wheels firmly connected to the ground. And the tyre combo is superb, the Assegai up front being particularly reliable when cornering across loose rocks and braking ruts. Perhaps what surprised us most about the GT Force was that it didn't require a radical readjustment to get the most out of it, and it doesn't feel that awkward on less extreme terrain. I think a lot of this boils down to the suspension design, which is really more of a mid-pivot platform compared to something like the Norco range. It doesn't have a radical rearward axle path. In fact, the rear wheel only moves about 10 millimeters backwards throughout the travel. And while it doesn't devour bigger rocks quite as effortlessly as the Range, there is less wheelbase extension, and that means that weight distribution remains more predictable through the corners. The short back end no doubt helps in terms of overall agility and cornering performance, though it is nice to have the option of that longer setting if you did want to increase high-speed stability even further. While the GT Force is a very impressive bike on the descents, at over 16 kilos, this is one of the heaviest bikes we've tested, and it does require a lot of energy input from the rider to accelerate on any trail that has a remotely upwards gradient. It is plenty comfortable on the climbs thanks to that steep seat tube angle and the tall front end, and there's minimal bobbing from the rear suspension. In fact, we never had to reach for that climb switch when we were riding off-road. It also proved to be remarkably proficient on technical climbing features. There's a ton of traction on tap and also minimal hang up from the rear wheel. As long as you've got the energy, it can rock crawl its way up some pretty horrendous stuff. You will burn through some serious calories in the process though, and that largely boils down to the overall weight, the heavy wheels and the aggressive tyre spec. The gearing is also quite tall for such a heavy, long travel 29er. We've got a 32 tooth chainring paired to an 11 to 50 tooth cassette on the rear. Riders who prefer to spin rather than mash their way up the climbs will likely want to fit a smaller chainring in order to save their knees. The idler pulley is also quite noisy in those lower gears. It's certainly noisier than the Cannondale Jekyll, which we understand is down to the different chain line between the two bikes, with the Jekyll using an offset rear hub to straighten out the chain. The noise isn't too bad though, it's certainly quieter than an e-bike motor, and you do tend to tune it out after the first couple of rides. While the frame is mostly finished well, it's nice and solid and there's plenty of useful armour, the cable routing does leave a lot to be desired. There's no provision to clamp down the cables where they enter and exit the oversized frame ports, and that results in an irritating amount of rattling. There's also some rubbing in some areas of the frame, particularly around the back of the seat tube where the rear brake hose and the derailleur cross over. It's not unsolvable for Force owners, but it's still really disappointing to encounter such an issue on a bike that costs over $6,000. I've also not been particularly impressed by the wheels on this bike, which are cheap, heavy, and they feel soft and sluggish on the trail with a slow engaging free hub. Combined with the cheap NX Eagle cassette, the rear hub makes quite the racket when you're thumping down chunky descents. The dropper post is quite sluggish, and the steep seat tube angle means the saddle still manages to get in the way even when it's fully compressed. We'd like to see a longer dropper post on the medium-sized frame, and a more ergonomic lever would be really nice as well. And that, folks, brings us to the verdict of the 2022 GT Force. Well, this is an absolute brute of a bike that yearns for the hardest and fastest descents you can possibly take it down. It excels on the chunkiest of terrain, where the high pivot suspension design and the raked out geometry allow it to carry some serious momentum, while the high front end keeps you feeling planted and secure at warp speeds. The hefty weight and aggressive rubber means this isn't a bike for everyday trail rides. It does climb comfortably, but it requires a lot of energy from your legs in the process. As a result, this isn't the bike we'd be reaching for to tackle a 40-kilometer alpine epic with 2,000 meters of climbing in it. But while it may not be the all-rounder that its predecessors once were, for the gravity-focused riders and competitive enduro types out there who value technical high-speed descending above all else, there is very little that will get in the way of the GT Force. Now, we'll point out that there is a load more information in the full review of this bike, which is now live over at flowmountainbike.com. Click that link in the video description below right now, and that will take you through to the full review of this bike right here. If you've got any questions for us, there's a good chance they're already answered in the review, but if not, drop those into the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Otherwise, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time round. Tooroo!